Today I'm going to talk about smallpox because pandemics and vaccination campaigns are rather on everyone's minds right now, and also because the eradication of smallpox is considered the greatest achievement in international public health, and we could all use something to celebrate. But prepare yourself, this is going to get gross. Smallpox is caused by the variola virus, and it is thousands of years old. A smallpox-like rash has been found on mummies from the 12th century BCE in Egypt, and it is almost definitely much older than that, maybe even 10,000 years old. We have writings from China and India from the 1100s BCE that describe what is most likely smallpox, indicating that it had gotten at least that far by then and was probably endemic to those areas. We should probably talk about the difference between an endemic disease, an epidemic, and a pandemic. An endemic disease is one that is regularly found in a particular population or in a certain area. Malaria is currently endemic to parts of Central and South America and Africa, but not endemic to Norway. An epidemic, on the other hand, is a rapid spread of a disease to a large number of people. It's a technical term that refers to an often sudden increase in the number of cases above what is normally expected in that population in that area. And a disease outbreak is considered a pandemic when it is spread to a large number of people in several countries or continents, and sometimes the entire world. For thousands of years, smallpox has been endemic to large parts of the world. Starting, we think, in North Africa, it spread along trade routes everywhere people went. It reached Northern Europe at the latest in the 11th century CE when Crusaders brought it back from the Middle East. It reached Western Africa in the 14th century CE with Portuguese traders and slavers. And most famously, it reached the Americas with the Spanish. With each of these introductions into people who had never encountered smallpox before, it caused epidemics. When smallpox is endemic, it has a mortality rate of 30%. Meaning that 30% of all the people who get smallpox die, which is huge. But when it's introduced into a naive population, the mortality rate can be as high as 90%. Partially, that's because so many people were sick at the same time that they couldn't really take care of each other, and so often died of secondary causes. But it's also just because none of those people or their immune systems had ever encountered the disease before. It wiped out entire villages and helped cause the defeat of both the Aztec and Inca empires by the Spanish. Wave after wave of smallpox epidemics washed over the Americas, including one that started just before the American Revolution and wreaked havoc in the Continental Army and Native Americans all across North America. If you have any interest in learning more about that epidemic, Elizabeth Fenn has written a fascinating book about it called Pox Americana that I definitely recommend. Smallpox is a disease of large populations. To spread, it requires direct face-to-face contact, coughing or sneezing droplets, or contact with the scabs or fluid from a patient's sores. And famously, if those scabs or fluid from a patient's sores get onto a piece of fabric, such as a blanket, it can also be spread that way. Although the incubation period, the time during which you have the disease but you're not showing any symptoms yet, is 7 to 19 days, so you can potentially get quite a long distance to spread the disease. You're not actually contagious during that time. By the time you are contagious, you're already feeling the first symptoms of very high fever, horrible head and body aches, and sometimes vomiting. And you don't feel up to doing your normal daily activities, let alone traveling long distances. And you're only the most contagious when you've already developed the distinctive, frankly horrifying looking rash, and people aren't going to want to be around you. Which is why in smallpox epidemics, you often saw one village hit very hard, sometimes destroyed, and the next village over wasn't touched at all. It all depended on whether somebody who had the disease but wasn't showing any symptoms yet had traveled to that village or not. So when you have a large population gathered into cities, smallpox can continue to spread and become endemic. But when you have a small population, or it's just in small villages, smallpox tended to die out. So when a new case was introduced, epidemics could happen. Once European colonists overran the Americas, Africa, Australia, and the islands of Polynesia and Micronesia, smallpox was endemic to large parts of the world. There were still epidemics even into the 20th century, including a large one in Boston in 1902. But smallpox was a scourge that affected the entire world. And it's a horrible disease. This is where it's going to get gross, so if you need to skip ahead a bit, I completely understand. Like I said before, the first symptoms are a high fever, head and body aches, and sometimes vomiting, and those last between 2 to 4 days. Then you begin to develop the rash. It starts as small red spots on your tongue and in your mouth, and then those spots develop into sores that break open and spread large amounts of the virus into your mouth and throat. You still have a high fever at this point. Next, the rash begins to spread along your body, starting with your face and then along your arms and legs to your hands and feet. Your fever goes away at this point, and you may actually start to feel better, except for the rash everywhere, of course. By the 4th day of the rash, your sores begin to fill with a thick, opaque fluid, often with a dent in the center. Your fever may rise again and stay high for the next couple of weeks. You're the most contagious during this phase. Next, the sores become pustules, which are sharply raised, slightly round, and firm to the touch, feeling like small peas under your skin. For the next 5 days or so, your pustules begin to form a crust and then scab over, but this takes a while. It's not until the end of the 2nd week after you first develop the rash that all of your pustules have scabbed over. Then for the next 6 days, your scabs begin to fall off, leaving marks on your skin. You're still contagious until all of your scabs have fallen off. Gross, huh? And think about it. That's 4 solid weeks when you can't really function. You can't go to work or the grocery store, and you shouldn't be around other people because you're contagious this whole time. And for a lot of it, you can't even take care of yourself. Even if you were one of the lucky ones who survived smallpox, you were probably significantly scarred. And up to 1/3 of smallpox survivors went blind. So you can see why smallpox epidemics were extremely disruptive. Luckily, we have a vaccine that prevents it. In fact, the word and concept of a vaccine came from our efforts to prevent smallpox. Before the concept of a vaccine, people used something called variolation to try to prevent smallpox deaths. Variolation is the process whereby material from a smallpox sore is introduced into a person who has never had smallpox before. Sometimes that's by scratching the skin and inserting the material that way, and sometimes that's by inhaling crushed up sores. Imagine that. And variolation didn't necessarily prevent smallpox. You usually still got the disease, but often with an easier course, and fewer people died. Still, deciding to be variolated was a very difficult decision for people. Famously, George Washington had to insist that his wife Martha do it. And Abigail Adams is also well known for having all of her children variolated during the American Revolution. But once you'd been variolated and had the lesser course of the disease, you were subsequently immune to smallpox. But variolation obviously wasn't ideal. In 1796, a doctor named Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had had a disease called cowpox and then got variolated didn't show any symptoms from smallpox, and they never did get smallpox after that. So Jenner performed a highly unethical experiment. He took material from cowpox sores from a milkmaid named Sarah Nemes, and he inoculated them into the arm of a 9-year-old boy named James Phipps. Months later, Jenner exposed Phipps to smallpox a number of times, and he never developed the disease. This new process was called vaccination because it came from a disease affecting cows, and the Latin for cow is vacca. Several other people had actually developed a similar process before Jenner, but Jenner was the one to publish his data, so his is the story we tell. Jenner hoped that this new process of vaccination would lead to the eradication of smallpox. And it would, but not for almost 200 years. In 1959, the World Health Organization initiated a comprehensive smallpox eradication program. At first, it suffered from a lack of funds, personnel, and commitment from the countries of the world, as well as a shortage of vaccine donations from pharmaceutical companies. Something this huge, the eradication of a human disease from the face of the earth, had never been seriously attempted before. But the political will was there, and in 1967, the intensified eradication program began. This time, laboratories in countries where smallpox was still endemic were able to mass produce large quantities of freeze-dried vaccine. Other factors also helped. The development of the bifurcated needle, which made administration of the vaccine easier, the development of a surveillance system to detect and investigate cases, and mass vaccination campaigns that were performed by doctors, nurses, and volunteers from all over the world. Smallpox had already been eradicated from North America in 1952 and Europe in 1953, but thanks to this new program, it was effectively gone from South America in 1971, Asia in 1975, and Africa in 1977. The last person to have naturally occurring variola major was Rahima Banu, a 3-year-old girl from Bangladesh, and the last person to have naturally occurring variola minor, a slightly less devastating form of the disease, was Ali Mau Malin, a hospital cook and eradication volunteer from Somalia. In order to ensure that they were the last people, they were both isolated under guard for 24 hours a day until they were no longer infectious, and a mass vaccination campaign was done within a 5-mile radius. Both of them survived. Ali Mau Malin actually died of malaria in 2015 while he was working on the polio eradication campaign. But there was one more death due to smallpox. In 1978, a medical photographer named Janet Parker was working on the floor above the medical microbiology department of the Birmingham University Medical Center, where smallpox research was being conducted. Somehow, possibly through the air ducts that connected the 2 floors, Janet contracted smallpox and died. Her mother also contracted smallpox directly from Janet, but she survived. But that should have been that. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization declared the world officially free from smallpox, the first and so far only human disease ever to have been eradicated. Yay! However, smallpox still exists in laboratories. In 1980, 4 countries kept variola virus to study it: the US, the UK, South Africa, and Russia, then the USSR. By 1984, both the UK and South Africa had gotten rid of their samples, but smallpox virus still exists in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta in the US and in the State Research Center for Virology and Biotechnology, the Vector Institute, in Koltsova, Russia. And part of the reason for that is that smallpox is a disease that scares the pants off people, making it a probable bioterrorism threat. It's contagious face-to-face, it has a very high mortality rate, and an even higher disruption to society rate, especially in a population that has never encountered the disease before, like most of the people alive today. So the US and Russia have kept variola virus around to study it. The CDC is trying to find better antiviral drugs to treat smallpox and to improve tests to detect it. They're also trying to develop a safer vaccine. The current vaccine is a live one, meaning that people who are immunocompromised might have trouble with it. Now, the vaccine is based off of the vaccina virus, which is related to but not the variola virus, so no one could actually get smallpox from it. But the CDC is still trying to make it safer. And speaking of the vaccine, the CDC says, and I quote, "There is enough smallpox vaccine to vaccinate every person in the US should a smallpox outbreak occur." So that's good news. And at this point, even a single confirmed case of smallpox would be considered a huge medical emergency. But even with the concern of the last remaining stocks of smallpox virus, this is a story of celebration. The world came together to completely eliminate a human disease from the face of the earth. Let's do it again. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and you think you'll be interested interested in more videos about public health, click like and subscribe. Thank you. I hope to see you soon.